Well, Tullio is our convener, and Tullio has asked me to introduce Sam, and that is a true pleasure. I don't remember having had this opportunity yet, so I'm going to enjoy introducing Sam. Sam is a product of Wesleyan University, a very proud and active alumnus of Wesleyan in Middletown, Connecticut. Went to NYU Medical School and then stayed on Manhattan Island, but moved uptown to the Manhattan Eye and Ear Infirmary where he did his residency. He came west for a year to do his fellowship in neurotology at UCSF. He is currently the professor and vice chair of the Department of Otolaryngology, but he's also jointly appointed in neurology and neurosurgery at the Weill Cornell Medical School, and also is professor of neurological surgery at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Now, Sam is past president of both the American Otologic and American Neurologic Society, and as you'll hear, has a very strong background in academic publishing. Not only has he published a textbook on differential diagnosis, but he chaired the oversight board of Otology Neurotology, Inc., which oversees the administrative and business operations of that journal. And in 2019, became the 9th editor of Laryngoscope, which many of you realize is the oldest and largest peer-reviewed journal in our field. Now at home, as you're hearing, Sam is the father of 3 sometimes rather rambunctious sons. He is, you may not know, fluent in French and unabashed Francophile. He's actually a visiting doctor in residence at the American Hospital in Paris. But he's got a tough side. He ran his family's trucking company for many years, and running a trucking company in the greater New York area takes a certain kind of grit, I suspect, Sam. He is also an honorary police surgeon in the New York Police Department, which means basically he can park anywhere in New York and just show his badge. He frequently appears on the media commenting on ear disease. I didn't mention it, but 30 years ago, in 1990, he was my neurotology fellow at UCSF, and I am immensely proud of Sam's career accomplishments, and particularly his leadership of Laryngoscope really as a crowning new assignment within really a stellar career. So thank you, Sam, and welcome virtually to Stanford.
Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here and to see old friends and to meet others. I'd like to thank you for the confidence that you've put in me, that I can attract viewers, putting me up against the presidential debate. But that's, I'm confident we'll have enough folks sticking around. So, we're going to take a view through the Laryngoscope, a look into the world of scholarly publishing. And as you can see, Laryngoscope has been around for a long time, since 1896. So staying in that vein of presidential politics, this is the president at the time in 1896, a vile and kind of an awful man and a bad president, but Grover Cleveland, who was born in Essex County, New Jersey, which is where I live now, and is noteworthy for 2 things. Number one, he's the only president to have been elected twice non-consecutively, and also he had an otolaryngologic issue, that he had a squamous cell cancer of the hard palate, and had a aggressive surgery at sea in the mid-1890s and survived that. Also, for historical context, around 1896 was ending up the Panic of 1893, which was a economic depression based on the collapse of international markets. The 45th state was admitted, Utah. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled on Plessy versus Ferguson that put in place racial segregation that lasted until the 1960s, and the Dow Jones was formed. But around this time, Max Goldstein, who received his MD from Missouri Medical College, later known as Washington University, was a budding otolaryngologist that did his training in the United States, but also went to Europe, worked with Adam Politzer. He was ambitious. He founded the Central Institute for the Deaf, and also at the age of 26, founded the Laryngoscope. In volume 1, issue 1 of the Laryngoscope, 1896, he wrote, in these days of rapid medical progress, when advances are not made step by step, but by bound, like the leaping hound, the ordinary medical mortal is left behind, distanced and out of the race. His response was to make the Laryngoscope, in which it was endeavored each month to keep the reader posted on all important advances in rhinology, laryngology, and otology. And in fact, I think the Laryngoscope has not wavered from this ideal. So he was not only editor-in-chief, but was also the publisher and the owner of the Laryngoscope, and reigned for 45 years, which is truly extraordinary. Now, the Laryngoscope was a publication of, well, based in St. Louis at Washington University, and he was succeeded by Theodore Walsh, who was the next department chair and was the publisher, editor, and owner for 25 years, and Joe Ogura another 16 years after that. So all of this stayed at WashU in St. Louis. When Ogura died, however, there was a change that was going on. So this is, we're talking now about the Laryngoscope, but let's shift gears and talk for a moment about the Triological Society, which was also formed at the end of the 19th century in 1893. And the American Rhinological and Otological Society. And election to membership was the imprimatur, and still is, of professional and scholarly excellence in otolaryngology. The society held meetings to discuss research findings for its members and guests, but didn't have a publication, and realized that the Laryngoscope was a preeminent journal in otolaryngology. And upon the death of Dr. Ogura, the leadership approached his widow and had a financial settlement, and along with that accepted the newly appointed Washington University co-editors, and the Triologic and the Laryngoscope became one. So these were the co-editors up through 1994, Stanley Thawley and Gershon Spector for 11 years. And then a national search was done, the first national search for editor-in-chief. And Ron Bailey, the founder of UT Texas Branson Galveston ENT department, and editor of Bailey's Head and Neck Surgery, was the editor-in-chief for the next 9 years. And he led the journal through an arrangement, leaving the publisher that was in St. Louis, a parochial publisher, and getting the journal into a national and, in fact, international publisher, Lippincott. And that allowed for a significantly highly profitable relationship for the journal, which continues today. And those funds go to the Triological Society to support the educational mission and the research mission and the travel grants for residents. Following Dr. Bailey was Jonas Johnson, the chair at University of Pittsburgh. He was editor-in-chief for 8 years, and he had the Herculean task of transitioning the journal from a paper journal into a digital journal. And I can't even imagine what it must have been like getting stacks of manuscripts on a daily basis. And thanks to his work, everything is digital and it's much easier. He was followed by Mickey Stewart, again for 8 years, who led the journal through a period of tremendous growth. And then at the end of this period, I've been editor-in-chief for the past year. Well, there's a team that leads the Laryngoscope. We have 16 associate and section editors that are really important for content evaluation. I personally simply cannot be up to date on all areas of otolaryngology, and to have content editors is really important. There was never a general otolaryngology associate editor, so we recruited a comprehensive otolaryngology and also a case reports and video editor, which we hadn't had in the past. So this evening's presentation is going to be, I'd like to touch on a couple of things. Number one, we talked about the historical perspective, and we'll answer two questions. How to define a medical journal, specifically the responsibilities to stakeholders, and then how to define the quality of a medical journal. Then we're going to talk a bit about peer review, tips and pitfalls, and then finally about how the journal responded to a public health crisis. So how do we define the function of a medical journal? To whom is a medical journal responsible? A journal is responsible to the readers and scientific community, authors, reviewers, affiliated societies, publisher. But I'm going to focus in on the readers and scientific community. I think that's the most interesting, and the affiliated societies. I'm going to say a couple of words about both. So in terms of those responsibilities, of course, we want to attract and publish the best clinical and scientific research. But we also want to ensure the integrity of the journal. And we do that through two ways, through positive actions and through oversight. Oversight could be cause negative actions, or not quite policing actions, but oversight. Positive actions would include maintaining exemplary, unbiased peer review, providing author affiliations to allow for communications, for publishing letters to the editor. And the monitoring aspect, the oversight aspect, involves correcting errors, printing retractions, defining assurance and adherence to authorship. And we could talk about authorship probably for the rest of my allotted time, and conflict of interest. And then also to attempt to identify duplication and plagiarism. And we do that through the Authenticate plagiarism detection software. So how is plagiarism defined? It's defined by the editor-in-chief of what is an acceptable amount of duplication. There's only so many ways to begin a materials and methods section of a paper to describe a clinical study. So having duplication in that area is accepted. So up to 30%, I think, is reasonable. Above that, there are areas of concern. Let's take a look at some examples of that. So this is a report that I would get that says there's a similarity index of 52%, which is really to the side of the bell-shaped curve, really high. And with that, I get a report of the different articles where there's duplication, the amount of duplication, and these are all color-coded, which is nice. When you look at the actual manuscript, you can see the color coding. And the bottom line here is you see a lot of color instead of a lot of black and white. So this is a problem. But even a worse problem than this are blocks of color. So this is clearly duplication, plagiarism taken from other sources where whole sections of the paper are duplicated. So those are our responsibilities to the reader. How about to the affiliated societies? Well, the Laryngoscope has 3 affiliated societies: the Triological, which is also the owner, the American Laryngological, and the American Bronchoesophagological. And what does it mean to be an affiliated society? Well, the societies require their podium presentations to be submitted as papers to the Laryngoscope. The other thing is that there should be an overlap in terms of the goals, that everybody should be rowing in the same direction. And certainly for the Triologic, this is the mission statement and the 12 goals of the Triological Society. And you can see there's 4 that are directly related to the Laryngoscope: to encourage, support, and disseminate through meetings, print and electronic mediums, the latest basic and clinical research findings, so that there's a clear alignment of goals between the society and the journal. Now, here's an interesting question that we struggle with at editorial board meetings: is should the Laryngoscope accept requests or seek out additional affiliations from other societies? Well, there are advantages to that. The potential to grow the Triological Society membership, that's an advantage. The potential to publish additional outstanding clinical work, that's an advantage to get those papers. But we have a problem, and that the Laryngoscope has an extremely low acceptance rate. So what that means is if we get more societies involved, there may be disappointment for those authors of those societies that have to submit their work. Now, we also have something that's different, which is not affiliated society, but international editions. And those are already existing Laryngoscope papers printed for specific editions. In this case, for China, we can see the Chinese characters here, the Laryngoscope of China. And we have a Laryngoscope also for Japan. You can see the Japanese characters. Same thing true for Taiwan. So this is different when looking at affiliations. So we talked about historical perspective and how to define a medical journal. Let's talk about how to define the quality of a medical journal. And that's a bit ephemeral, but there are questions that we can ask. So the first is the journal well established? Is there a culture of impartial and speedy peer review? Is the journal a primary source of information for the specialty? Do authors want to publish in it? Is it well read? Is its strength reflected by objective metrics, and is it selective? And we'll talk about each one of these because I think this is interesting. So is it well established? This is a list of the, not comprehensive list, of the journals in otolaryngology. And the oldest continuously published journal is the Laryngoscope. Non-continuously is one that Dr. Jacklin knows very well, is the American Journal of Otology, which was published in the late 19th century and then was not published for 80 years and then published again. But it's interesting to note that there's growth, it's kind of stair-step growth in terms of journals. There's some from the late 19th century and then 20 years, and then in the 1920s, and then a 70-year break, and then a slew of journals in the 1970s, and then another break, so that they seem to come on in waves. Second question, is there a culture of impartial and speedy peer review? Impartial without a doubt, but speedy is going to require some explanation. So what are the steps from submission to publication? That can be broken into two groups. The steps from submission to acceptance and the steps from acceptance to publication. So the steps from submission to acceptance or to decision can be very fast. The rejections and referrals can be much faster. But there's a pre-assignment checklist so that whenever you submit a paper, there's a word limit, and somebody looks to see if you've met the word limit or exceeded it, and if you have, then there's sent back, and that takes time, but it's part of the process. Then there's the assignment to the editor-in-chief, and I assign to the associate editor, and then the associate editor identifies external reviewers. This is all pretty quick. The problem is here, assigning the external reviewers and that turnaround. Now, that turnaround, the information then goes to the associate editor and then to the editor-in-chief, and that cycle is the problem because this doesn't happen once. This happens with revisions. The chance of a submission being accepted without revision at the Laryngoscope is about 4%. So 96% of the time, that's not going to happen. So that these cycles of reviews take time. And when all of that happens, if you add it up together, and then the editor-in-chief makes a decision, that takes about 4 months. Again, rejections, referrals are faster. Now, once it's accepted, then there's copy editing, there's typesetting, there's layout, and then there's queries that get sent to the author and have to be responded to. And then early view online publication, that takes about 2 months. So from beginning to online publication is about 6 months. Print publication is slower. Print is a very small part of what we do, but is usually another 9 to 12 months in addition. So that we try to get things out within 12 months of acceptance. So is a journal a primary source of information? In other words, how big is the journal? The Laryngoscope is by far the largest journal in the field. It is 40% larger than the next largest journal, which the next largest is much bigger than the one smaller than that. So for example, common journals that you would know, journals 1 and 2 might have 300, 125 articles published per year. We publish over 550. And then this year, because of COVID and the pandemic, for a number of reasons, as of September 1st, we've already published 786. So that we are clearly the fire hose in terms of the amount of information getting out. Do authors want to publish in it? Yes. So when we look at manuscript submissions, they can be broken down into new manuscripts and then new plus revisions. With new manuscripts, so I was involved with the Journal of Otology and Neurotology, which is a extremely high caliber journal. And in 2015, when I left my relationship with them, the journal was getting between 600 and 700 submissions a year. And that was a very strong journal. So you can see that the Laryngoscope, and even in 2016, was getting, a good deal larger, 4 times that, 2,400 submissions. And this continues to go up again in 2020, projecting the last couple of months. It'll be about 3,500, and this is a staggering number that the total manuscripts, when you put in the revisions as well, is this year will break 4,000, and will break it soundly to be around 4,500 submissions. So what does that actually mean, real time? Real time, 4,500 submissions comes down to about 87 a week, which means in my inbox every day, 365 days a year is on average 12 submissions. Today there was 23, but it varies day to day. Countries also, we are an international journal. Less than half of the submissions come from the United States. The top other submitters are China, Italy, India, Korea, Turkey, and Japan. And it's interesting because some of these countries submit a lot and are a fair amount of work, but don't result in a lot of publications. That the qualities at some of these countries may not be exactly the same as in the United States. There can be language-related issues, so there's a fair amount of work for the journal for a proportionally less acceptance rate. So the acceptance rate for American submissions might be a third, 30, 35%, and it would be a fraction of that for some of the other countries. Is the journal well read? Yes. And let's talk now the difference between print and digital publications. Print in 2020, we print about 2,000 issues a year, which is not a bad number, but it's really not the focus of what we do. It's mostly to triological members, to ABEA members, and then for other reasons, there's print. To gauge the size of a journal in a digital standpoint, we do that through institutional licenses or through usage. And usage can be broken down into hits or page views or individuals looking at the journal. But the best indicator and the highest level indicator is downloads. Downloads is a relationship. The viewer is taking an action to actually get information that they value to download. So that's the highest level interaction. So in terms of subscriptions, there are thousands, 7,000 subscriptions, but I'm proud to say that all of these countries in gray that are not first level or industrial countries that would be considered third world countries that can't afford the Laryngoscope are either given licenses to the Laryngoscope or given significantly reduced licenses. But looking at downloading countries, and looking at this somewhat pie graph, this is a conglomeration of a lot of countries, but 41% are from the United States. And then looking down after that, we see China, United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, South Korea. And I think the point here is that after the United States, the next 5 countries, 4 out of the 5 are in Asia. So Asia is clearly our growing area outside of the United States for the Laryngoscope. And in terms of downloads, again, the best gauge overall for the journal, we can see that how our download numbers have gone up since 2010, as you might expect. But I consider this to be a very surprising number that we get, the Laryngoscope gets per month about 90,000 downloads per month. So that when we compare that to the 2000 print version, that's why I was commenting that print is something, I still like to read the print version, but is really quite small considered when compared to the digital version. So is the quality, is the strength reflected by objective metrics? And I think we should talk just for a moment about impact factor because everybody's heard about it, and I'm sure this is knowledge that everybody has, but indulge me, and I'll just go through it for those that may not be aware. It's a dominant metric in defining the importance of a journal. It's proof that the information in the journal is valued because it's being cited. The impact factor for a year looks at the 2 prior years, and it looks at the number of citations of the 2 prior years divided by the total numbers of paper, so the percent of citations. Now, the impact factor is a little bit like US News and World Report in that it's the 800-pound gorilla, it's the dominant metric. Not everybody likes it. I don't think everybody likes US News and World Report. There's plenty of complaints about that. And same thing with impact factor. It's an imperfect tool. It can be gamed. It can be manipulated. You can increase the number, the numerator, by self-citations, for example. And you could, if you wanted to, decrease the denominator by turning off the spigot, by publishing less, by slowing the flow of information. And neither of those things would make sense. But it's clear that a small denominator or small journals have a much better chance of quickly changing their impact factor because their denominator is small. The impact factor for the journal has been hovering around about 2.4 for the past 4 or 5 years. And why is the impact factor important? Does it have any real value? Well, it's often used by academic institutions for decision on promotion, especially in Europe and Asia, but certainly in the US as well. So that if someone is going from assistant to associate professor, the committee for promotions might look at the number of publications, but also where the publications took place, what journals. Also, high impact factor journals tend to draw more submissions. Does it actually matter for a large journal like Laryngoscope? It probably doesn't matter that much, but it certainly matters an awful lot for smaller journals. Are there better metrics? Yes, there are. One is the eigen factor, which uses both quantity and quality of citations, so that the citations are weighted. Self-citations are excluded, so you can't game the eigen factor that way. And citations are weighted by the quality of the citing journal, and there's a metric for that, so that being cited by the Lancet is different than being cited by a very small journal. So that looking at high quality, the Laryngoscope does very well against the other sister journals in the field. And then finally, is the quality of a medical journal, well, one of the biggest questions, is it selective? And the primary equation in peer-reviewed medical publishing is really determining the rejection rate. And I spend a lot of time thinking about that. The rejection rate is a balance between the aspirational principle of publishing as much exceptional quality work as you can versus the constraints of page numbers and both print and online. And there are downstream effects to that. If the rejection rate is not high enough, the backlog can be an issue. We've already said there's a year wait for print, so that's a problem. It can affect the flow of information. That information can become old when it comes out, and the responsibilities to the affiliated societies that are obvious. I also want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the integrity of the peer review process. And you may or may not realize, you probably do, that there is a firewall between the journal's scholarly functions and its business functions. The scholarly functions are overseen by the editor-in-chief of a journal. The business functions are by a different group or committee. In the case of the Laryngoscope, it's the executive committee of the Trilogical Society. And why is there a firewall? Well, we don't want to have the risk or the appearance of making a decision on a submission that's not entirely based on quality. So here's an example of a problem. Accepting a paper whose research was sponsored by company X, so that company X will buy advertising space in the journal. That's a clear conflict of interest, so that the editor-in-chief needs to be removed from any of those dealings, so that you shouldn't see editors in chief walking around speaking to industry and soliciting business. So with all that said, the acceptance rate for the journal has been pretty constant. It's been a fight, but we're at about 16%. Again, we had such a huge increase in submissions over the past year, but that's an overall. So I think we answered the question, how to judge the quality of a medical journal. Let's talk now a bit about a peer review. And first of all, thank you. If you do peer review, that is essential for peer review journals, obviously. But an invitation for peer review has certain implications that are important for you to recognize. Number one, that you're an expert in whatever, or at least you're knowledgeable in the area that we're asking you about, that we believe that your reputation of an individual that is worth listening to, that your ethical standard would be considered high, that we presume honesty and impartiality, and that you're altruistic. You're willing to do this work unpaid for a lofty goal, that being the dissemination of information that can help mankind, so that an invitation has meaning associated with it. how can you improve your peer reviews? And again, this is a nice 1-hour presentation on its own, but I'll give you a truncated version of this. First of all of the comments apply to original reports, in other words, general research, not to systematic literature review and meta-analysis, which requires a different skill set. I think this is a take-home message. Your charge is to assess the content of the paper and the methodology of the paper. Your charge is not to serve as a copy editor. We pay people to perform the tasks of correcting punctuation and spelling errors and syntax errors and layout, so that when when an editor gets a laundry list of those types of changes, that's frustrating. General instructions: just maintain the highest level of integrity in everything that you do. Respect the confidentiality. Be unbiased with respect to everything, to the gender of the authors, to the institution that it's coming from, to the country that it's coming from. Remember you're communicating with a colleague, so that while at times it's tempting to use inflammatory language, that serves no purpose at all. And you are speaking with a colleague, so that even if a journal is well below par, you should frame that in a way that's reasonable, because your criticisms should be constructive and not punitive. Even if the work is not going to be accepted by the Laryngoscope, which is what happens in the vast majority of cases, your comments can make the paper better, so that the authors can work on that and either resubmit it or submit it to another journal. So let's talk about flaws for a moment. There are a couple of flaws that you need to understand. First of all, virtually every submission is flawed in some ways. But there are non-fatal flaws, which is a true problem with the manuscript, but one that can be fixed without requiring starting from scratch. So here's an example. Is a methodology adequately described? If it's not, that's a problem, but it's a fixable problem. The authors can fix that. A fatal flaw is something that can't be fixed and still retain the same quality of the paper. So for example, here's a question that's a problem. Would the topic studied in this paper likely interest the readership of the Laryngoscope? If the answer is no, there's nothing that is going to be done that's going to fix that. That's a fatal flaw. That's going to end up in a rejection. So there are key points to consider in all the different parts of a paper, and let's go through those by section. So the title, the research question. We just looked at this with the title. Would it be interesting for the Laryngoscope? Do the authors propose a specific question that the study is trying to answer? In other words, is this hypothesis driven? Or is this a fishing expedition? That's going to be two totally different types of responses. Has a meaningful question been asked? Even if it's hypothesis driven, if the question that's being asked is not particularly meaningful, then that is a fatal problem. And does the study present novel information? If it doesn't, maybe that's not right for this journal, or maybe it is. It depends. So that's not a fatal flaw. From the methodology standpoint, is the methodology employed appropriate to answer the question? If it's not, that can't be fixed. Is it adequately described? That can be fixed. And is it adequately powered? In the results section, are the results appropriate to answer the question? Are they presented well? That can be fixed if it's not. And were the methods used, in other words, the statistics used to analyze results appropriate, and were they done appropriately? And are the figures and tables okay? In the discussion, do the authors give context, external validation? Do they discuss the results of their work in the context of existing literature? Is the literature review adequate? Do authors adequately discuss and offer insights? In other words, are they just telling you the results, or are they actually commenting on what those results might mean? And do they describe the limitations of the study? That has to happen. The conclusion: this is a problem that happens more often than you would expect. Are the conclusions of the study justified based on the results? In other words, are all the results true, but the conclusions that the authors make not based on those results? That can happen, and that's a problem. And then, of course, conflict of interest. So prior to writing your review, you should examine the references. You should perform a literature search. You should confirm that the information is novel and that is not a duplication of other prior works. And your review should be structured. And here there's many options. So I don't think there's a cookbook way of writing a review. What I would say is while there are many options, the one thing that's not an option is that it needs to be organized. And often writing a very brief one sentence summary, what's the take-home message is important. And then what are the key strengths of the study? And then what are the key weaknesses of the study? And then finally, the bulk of your review should be, what are your major criticisms? And these are criticisms looking from 30,000 feet of looking at the study in context. And then finally, the nitty-gritty, the part that is important. I'm sorry, before we get to them, the major criticisms include internal and external validity, but the minor criticisms, while they're important, again, getting tied up with punctuation and writing and all that is something to be avoided. You can comment by section. In other words, comment on the title of the research question, the introduction, the like. And that's fine and good, but it's certainly not required. That's why I say there are many options. And then also I would comment that the decision that you're making is a recommendation to the editors, so that should not weigh heavily on you. So there are times where you don't want to recommend major revision or reject because maybe you know the authors, the institution, or in some ways you feel weighted down by the decision. You shouldn't. The editor-in-chief reads reviews and takes that information and takes information from the associate editor and uses all of that to make a decision, so that that's where the decision is coming from, so that your work, your recommendation is important, but shouldn't be weighty. So factors to consider when making a recommendation: first of all, who are you reviewing for? How high is the bar? Are you reviewing for a high rejection rate journal? Or are you reviewing for a journal that is a startup, online, open access, not yet searchable by Medline, with no impact factor? So that the rejection rate is going to be different in those situations, and your recommendations may be different also. So let me give you an example of something that I see every day, many times a day. A submission that is a retrospective, moderate size, single institution study with no control group, so level 4 level of evidence, regarding a topic that's been written about many times, that's not flawed. In other words, there's no fatal flaw in it, but there's a lot of problems that make this a less appealing type of submission. And would that get accepted? It depends on the journal. Other things to keep in mind is that when you make revisions, make sure they're practical. If they're impossible, then just recommend rejection. Feel free, there's always a section to write to the editor-in-chief. Comments to the editor-in-chief are important if you have something important to say. If you're just going to copy everything from the comments to the author to the editor, that doesn't accomplish much. It's not a problem, but it doesn't accomplish that much. If the paper is sent for revision, always accept the request to revise. Because you've made recommendations, now see if the authors have adequately addressed them. So always accept requests and never make new criticisms. So that you have the opportunity when you originally review a paper to make all the criticisms that you want to. That's your opportunity. To do it at a revision stage after the authors have already addressed all the revisions, and then to have new revisions, that's kind of moving the goalposts. That's not fair to the authors. So, so try to avoid that. Please respect the time committed by the authors and the editorial staff and the associate editor, and please finish your review on time without prompting. This is the main reason why papers are delayed. And it's an unnecessary waste of time and resources to pursue late reviewers. It leads to antiquated data and frustration. And just to keep things in common, remember you're reviewing one paper. It's an important paper. if it's being sent out to get reviewed, it's going to be important. But it's one paper. The Laryngoscope is going to review 4,500 papers in 2020. So that chasing after reviewers is something that is, even though it's automated, is something that the journal would prefer not to do. So here's an example of a subpar review. This is of no real value. The reviewer writes, the article's too long, and the author's English is limited. A major revision is necessary. Well, they're not saying why it needs to be revised, what the problems are. So this is not valuable. This person would not be kept in the reviewer pool for the journal. Examples of a good review. First of all of those questions that we looked about, that we broke down of what's a fatal flaw and what's not, they're all in the checklist to help remind you, to help you think about that when you review for the Laryngoscope. This reviewer wrote, this investigation is a retrospective study where children underwent drug-induced sleep endoscopy, both prior to and after TNA. So concisely stated what happened, and the authors compared this using a blinded fashion. That's what the article's about. My major concern, so this is the major criticism part, with the manuscript is whether the findings are clinically relevant. Without knowing which of these children are either successful or unsuccessful surgically, one cannot make conclusions. So key point. Also, what are the strengths? It's an interesting idea. The DICE videos were reviewed in a blinded fashion. Those are good things. Weaknesses, it's retrospective. That's not fatal. Unclear indications for why the DICE was performed, no post-op PSG data. So there are some weaknesses. And then this reviewer breaks down into sections the introduction. Again, you don't have to break it down into sections, but this one did. The introduction does not support the reason for performing the investigation. That's good to know. In methods, did you use a DICE grading scale? In the discussion, your discussion doesn't highlight your findings, but rather seems more like a review of what's possible. So those are really important criticisms. Here's a different reviewer. And again, this reviewer, this person I know, and you wouldn't normally write this, but in comments to the executive editor, this paper is a mess. But the topic's important. With reworking, it may have some significance. And in this was a study about pandas. Sorry, oh boy, let's see if I can get back here. Pandas, and the authors attempt a retrospective cross-sectional patient satisfaction survey, but use a non-validated survey instrument. That's a problem. The reviewer then goes on to say the pandas is a disorder that cries out for well-done clinical studies, but this paper does little to help sort out that morass. And again, focuses on what the fatal flaw is, a non-validated survey. So that's everything I'm going to say about peer review and how to do it. Please reach out if you would like to be a peer reviewer to the journal. We'd be happy to have a discussion with you on that, and just reach out to the laryngoscope@gmail.com. And then finally, I'm going to end up by talking about the role of a medical journal in a public health crisis. So we just published this, the dissemination of information during the public health crisis of early COVID at the Laryngoscope. And the goal during these crises is to disseminate information broadly and quickly, and to maintain a robust peer review so that we still have high quality and we don't spread misinformation. There have been previous pandemics since the Laryngoscope since 1896, including the 1918 flu. You can see the numbers of deaths worldwide. The 1957, the SARS outbreak, the H1N1, and coronavirus. So what we did was we looked at the PubMed and Laryngoscope databases and searched for the terms that you would expect to look for what was published within 2 years of each of these outbreaks. And going specifically to our data for the present pandemic, we can see these are the numbers of articles published, and you can see that in the United States, March and April was a peak. Then this went down. Since this point, it's been around 40 a month. And we've had over 200 submissions in the first 4 months. About 10% of these were accepted for a total of 18 manuscripts. And when we compare that to the total history of all of the other pandemics combined, there are a total of 4 publications, so that this pandemic is generating a lot more research that is getting out there for clinicians to read, which is wonderful. Why is there a difference between this and the prior? Well, it's not the difference of the lack of otolaryngologic symptoms. They're all upper respiratory infection pandemics. There's no less zeal, I'm sure, for clinical research by prior otolaryngologists, and authors likely sent to the Laryngoscope or to other journals. So I can't really explain that. The acceptance rate early on, when things are coming out so quickly, we can't have high level of evidence work, that everything is observational and descriptive, but meaningful at that time. As time passes, the bar goes up, that more rigorous studies are required. And there can be duplications of ideas because the pandemic hit China first, and then Italy, and then New York, and there's going to be epiphanies or revelations at those different times in those different countries. So there may be repetition by the time it hits somewhere and it's new to you, but it's already been published because of prior experiences. When we look at the original reports, which is a good reflection of level of evidence, these are months. This is March, April, May, June. We can see that that number goes up significantly, so we're getting better quality. We're also, and contemporary reviews is just the opposite, is more observational, and that number is going down, so that reflects the higher quality as time goes on. Not surprisingly, from a subject standpoint, anosmia was the most common. The impact and changes in clinical practice, how we practice now, how long it takes to turn over an exam room, and PPE protection, those are all fall within impact changes in clinical practice, and you can see the other different topics that we cover. One thing we're especially proud of is the turnover time. As I mentioned, in 2019, I said about 6 months from turnover from submission to online publication. It was actually 196 days, 6.5 months. But for COVID, we were able to get that down to 45 days because we wanted to get this information out quickly. And we did that by flagging papers, by accelerating the post-production processing, and by leapfrogging the non-COVID papers to get them to the front of the line. And this is the homepage for the Laryngoscope yesterday. And you can see that the first thing you see is highlighted COVID content, broken down by subject heading. And all of this is free. You do not have to have a license or a subscription. All this information is disseminated due to the pandemic. So what did we achieve? We, the medical community, we provided actionable, timely scientific communications in the field of otolaryngology. There was novel methods for tracheostomy and anosmia as a diagnostic tool. But there were problems too. There were lessons learned. So for example, despite the urgency, we cannot allow for the inadvertent spread of misinformation of hydroxychloroquine being published in the New England Journal and the Lancet that had to be retracted. And all of that has a global impact. So in summary, what we covered tonight was a historical perspective, how to define a medical journal, how to define the quality of a medical journal, peer review, hopefully tips to make you a little bit better a peer reviewer, and then how we respond when the chips are down, the public health crisis. So I'm sorry for squeezing in so much in a relatively short period of time. I thank you for your attention, and I'll stop here and take any questions.
Well, Sam, I see we have a number of questions up on the chat line. Are you able to see those?
Yes. Let's take a look. So the first one, let's see. Thanks for letting us peek through this window. I've noticed the Laryngoscope does not blind reviewers to, so we are a single blind journal. In the United States, it's about 50-50 between double blind and single blind. And this is something that is, we could certainly change, would be kind of a heroic change in terms of workflow. And that's made it less less appealing to go through that, but is a criticism. But about half the country is like that, or half the journals. From Dr. Nyack, thank you for the presentation. May I ask how associate editors are chosen? So they're chosen by the editor-in-chief, with two exceptions. The associate editor for laryngology is chosen in concert by the American Laryngologic Society, one of the affiliated societies, and the editor-in-chief. And then the same thing for the American Bronchoesophagological Society. So that those are chosen in concert, otherwise is chosen. And the way I decide, the way I chose on the basis of, does someone have the experience and seniority to really understand their field, both clinically and from a basic science standpoint? Were they good reviewers? Were they prompt reviewers? And are they committed? So is it timely return of past reviews or done by nomination? Just curious. Okay, so I think I addressed that. From Dr. Megwalo. The presentation is very insightful, thanks. Sometimes when manuscripts are sent back for revision, the reviewers request expanding on discussion, which may push the manuscript beyond word limits. Are word limits exceptions made? Yes, we're very soft about that. So that if we're asking you to make a change and asking for more information, then we will be very flexible with the word limit. Thank you very much from George Chirago. And then Nick, can you please comment on the role of open access journals like LIO and how they may best interface with more traditional publications? So all of them, or the major journals in otolaryngology, also have a open access journal. We don't know the future of medical publishing. Medical publishing has changed dramatically in terms of the business model over the past few years, past 2 years, but even beyond, let's say the past 5 years. So that the way publishers, like Wiley, our publisher, gets revenue is different. And there are countries and, state of California and institutions that only want open access. And open access, by the way, Laryngoscope publishes both traditional and open access. But some of these countries, and I think California, want only open access journals. So even though you can publish open access in Laryngoscope, want to publish only in a journal, which is why we have an LIO. While this has taken hold, we don't know if it's going to further take hold and spread throughout the country. If that's the case, an LIO will become dominant, and Laryngoscope may fuse with it. But for the time being, the amount of growth in LIO is less so. So that LIO still is young, and at this point is still working on getting an impact factor, and that takes time. From Dr. Orloff, thank you for enlightening us. I've reviewed manuscripts for many years and never knew it wasn't helpful to comment on structure, grammar, etc. Can you please offer advice on how to select a journal to which submit? Okay. So in terms of the details, if there's a really important bit of grammar that changes the meaning of a critical part of an argument, then by all means point that out. But going through journal from A to Z to major journals is not necessary, and in fact is, I think, counterproductive. Can you please offer advice on how to select a journal to which to submit a manuscript? Well, I think there's maybe two aspects. Actually, that second question that I asked has a lot to do with that, judging the quality of a journal, all those questions that we went through. But is the journal, when it's published, will it go to readers who will be interested in what you're writing about, and readers that you want to reach? And then two, is the journal large enough that it will actually reach a lot of readers? So I think there's two parts to that. And then, and I think, yes, the rest of that. And then from Jason Creon, thanks for an extremely interesting talk. I was wondering how the cover art of the print journal is chosen. I do that. It is one of the menial tasks that is on my plate, but one that I enjoy. So that in any issue, print issue, I look through every single figure and choose. And the things that I try to choose, I try to get a balance and not choose, for example, a head and neck figure 2 or 3 months in a row, or a plastic surgery, facial plastics illustration. And I want to have something that is almost always a color and not a black and white illustration. And from, let's see, from, good presentation, sorry. I think thank you. You know good art when you see it. Oh, that's true. Good art. I've worked a lot with Rob Jackler and Christine Graylop, so I know all about good art. From Rob, the business model traditionally has been subscription revenue, individual institutional. Do you envision expansion of author fee supported model? Any thoughts on how we can counter the proliferation of predatory journals? So great questions. The business model right now, the vast share of revenues that come to the journal are through licensure. So Stanford University buys a license to give out Laryngoscope to as many Stanford employees and students and residents as it wants. So there's no number. It's not a certain number. It's for everything. It's often bundled with other journals, so maybe other Wiley journals, for example. So that the subscription revenue is virtually nothing for the Laryngoscope in terms of individual subscriptions. The vast majority is institutional, which is licensure. Any thoughts on how we can counter proliferation of predatory journals? Boy, it's something that we talk about a lot. Amongst the editor-in-chief, there's a group of editors-in-chief. That's just something that is a topic that comes up. And yeah, I think you have to be a responsible author. I think you have to do your due diligence and read about the journal that is pursuing you. And then from Mike, thanks, Dr. Sussman. As residents, sometimes we are asked to review manuscripts, even though we may not feel like we are expert. Okay, good. So first of all, if you want to, first of all, who is asking you? If you're attending or your professor is asking you, then that's a conversation you have with that person. If it's a journal directly reaching out to you, the only way they would do that I could imagine, is if you've published on this before. And you should absolutely refuse if you don't feel comfortable. You can also respond by saying that I feel comfortable with the content part, but maybe not the biostatistics part. And that's something that we could help out with. So that brings us to 10 o'clock. And I think those are all the questions that I see.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for flying across the country this evening and flying back home. It's 7 p.m. and time for dinner for all of us.
Yes.
I know with your European interest, it's a Spanish dinner for you.
Yeah.
All right. Please say hello to Alex from Lori and I. And thank you again for a really terrific talk, Sam.
You bet. Thanks for the invitation.